we have Dr. Mearsheimer with us from the University of Chicago. Thank you for being here with us, Dr. Sharma.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah, so let me introduce Professor Mearsheimer to us. So Professor Mearsheimer is the R. Wendell Harrison Distinguished Service Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago, where he has taught since 1982. He has a PhD in political science from Cornell University from 1981 and has written extensively about security issues and international politics. Among his 6 books, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics won the Joseph Lepgold Book Prize, and The Israel Lobby and US Foreign Policy with Stephen M. Bald in 2007 made the New York Times bestseller list and has been translated into 24 languages. His latest book is The Great Delusion, Liberal Ideals and International Realities, which came out in 2018, which won the 2019 Best Book of the Year award from the Waldai Discussion Conference in Moscow. He has written numerous articles and op-eds that have appeared in International Security, London Review of Books, Foreign Affairs, the Financial Times, the New York Times. Well, it's a pleasure to have you here. Yeah, let's get into it. I think before we get into the more serious policy-based questions, I want to ask you, what is the one thing you think that is the most interesting aspect of the Sino-American relationship?
I think the most interesting question at this point in time is whether China will continue to rise economically over the next 30 years, similar to the way it has risen over the past 30 years. Much of my analysis focuses on the question of how China will act if it continues to rise. And I, in effect, just assume that China will continue to rise. But that's not clear. There are a large number of people, including very smart people in China who I've met over the years, who believe that China is not going to enjoy the kind of sustained growth in the future that it has in the past, that there are structural problems inherent in the Chinese society that make continued impressive economic growth unlikely. I'm not sure whether that's true or not, but I think it's a fascinating question.
Do you think there are tensions that are developing between US and China are largely security-based, as you argue, or are economic threats independently also considerably significant?
Well, I think those two kinds of threats are woven together. It's very difficult to separate one from the other. You don't have to be a Marxist to understand that the foundation of military might is economic might. And I've long argued that as China grew more powerful economically, it would translate that economic might into military might. And it would cause huge problems for the United States. So when the United States looks at the Chinese economy and thinks about economic growth in China, thinks about the development of sophisticated technologies in China, it's not simply an economic threat, it's also a military threat. As China's per capita GNP goes up and up and up, it becomes more of a military threat to the United States. So when you see Donald Trump taking aim at Huawei and other Chinese companies, this is not just economic warfare. It has a powerful security dimension as well.
Surely, yes. I do think it's hard to separate them. Do you think America can, or has America been keeping up with the economic and technological expansion at the rate of Chinese growth and development?
Well, it was impossible for the United States to keep up with Chinese economic development because China started at a very low level. It was a quite backward society in the early 1980s. So there was never any question that it was going to grow much more rapidly over the next 30 years than the United States would grow. The United States economy has grown in impressive ways over that period, but obviously at a slower rate than the Chinese economy. I think the question now, and this gets back to your initial question, the question now is what happens over the next 30 years? Does Chinese economic growth really slow down, or does it continue at a much more impressive rate than American growth? That's the big question. But this is, we're talking about relative gains here. So you can make an argument that in an absolute sense, the American economy has performed very well, but that doesn't matter much if in relative terms, the Chinese economy has performed better than the American economy and will continue to perform better than the American economy. So it's really relative gains that matter here.
All right. In terms of security threats and the Cold War analogy, do you think this situation is efficiently assessed in terms of a Cold War, or were the situations during the Cold War much more serious to be parallelly compared to the current tensions between the two countries?
Well, I think that what's going on in terms of the Sino-American relationship um, uh, is similar to the Cold War. And there we were talking about the US-Soviet relationship, in the sense that both involve a serious security competition. We're talking about great powers, eyeball to eyeball, in an intense security competition where there is a serious possibility of war. So in that sense, this is a new Cold War. But when you begin to look at the specifics of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, and what is now developing between the United States and China, I think you see quite clearly that these are different situations. First of all, the Soviet Union was a communist state. And as a communist state, it had real problems in terms of economic growth. Communism was a highly inefficient economic system, certainly after the 1970s. The problem that the Americans face with China is that it's not a communist state, it's a capitalist state. And the Chinese are very good at capitalism. And there's a great danger that they will, as we like to say, eat our lunch. So that's one important difference. Another important difference is that the geography of the Cold War is very different than the geography of the US-China competition. In the Cold War, the focus of the security competition was the Central Front in Europe. And it was a situation where you had two massive armies on either side of the inter-German border that were armed to the teeth with thousands of nuclear weapons. And in that situation, it was very hard to imagine a war between the United States and its NATO allies on one side and the Soviet Union and its Warsaw Pact allies on the other side, because that war probably would have led to nuclear Armageddon. The idea of these two massive military forces with thousands of nuclear weapons crashing into each other was almost unthinkable. So in a very funny way, the Cold War was quite stable because the consequences of a war would have been so horrendous. If you fast forward to the present and you look at the geography in East Asia, or you look at the geography between India and China, it's much easier to imagine a war breaking out over, say, the South China Sea, or Taiwan, or the East China Sea, or the line of control between India and China, because these conflicts would take place in relatively remote areas. It would not be like the center of Europe. So I think actually the chances of a war between the United States and China, or India and China, is much greater than was the chance of war between the United States and the Soviet Union, or NATO and the Warsaw Pact during the Cold War. Now, I want to be clear here. I'm not saying that a war is likely. I'm just making the point that a war is more likely in this new Cold War than in the old Cold War. And the other point that we don't want to lose sight of here, which is enormously important, is that it's relatively easy to imagine nuclear weapons being used in a war between the United States and China in the middle of the South China Sea. I think states are going to be remarkably reluctant to use nuclear weapons when it involves targeting large civilian areas. For the Americans to use nuclear weapons against the Chinese mainland, I think is almost unthinkable. But when you start positing scenarios where there's a conflict in the South China Sea or the East China Sea, it becomes easier. That's not to say easy, but it becomes easier to imagine nuclear weapons being employed. So I think moving forward, if China continues to grow, we're going to be operating in a very dangerous world.
The next question is that I want to delve into a little bit of Chinese relations with other countries as well. But before that, I think in a recent interview, I think around August, you mentioned how growing aggression in a country's foreign policy is inevitable, and the same applies to China. Some other scholars seem to argue, though, that might not necessarily be the case. Now, I have two questions in this aspect. I'll ask them separately. But the first is that, do you see a difference in the rise of the Chinese to that of the way America rose to its position as a hegemon?
Well, my view is that any time a country becomes more powerful, its position in the balance of power begins to change in profound ways, that country will seek to achieve regional hegemony. I don't care whether it's Japan, whether it's India, whether it's China, whether it's Vietnam. A country that becomes more powerful will want to dominate its region of the world because that's the best way to survive in international politics. You know, my argument that there's no higher authority in international relations. There's no institution or superstate that sits above states and can intervene to protect them. So therefore, we have very powerful incentives in international relations to be the most powerful state in the system, which in my argument means being a regional hegemon. So I don't find it at all surprising that in the 1930s, Japan tried to dominate Asia. I don't find it at all surprising that Germany twice tried to dominate Europe. I've said in Poland that if Poland all of a sudden became the most powerful state in Europe and was beginning to grow more powerful, Poland would try to dominate Europe. Just like India will try to dominate Asia if it becomes increasingly powerful. This is just the way the system works. And what's happening now in Asia?
Oh, I can't hear you anymore. Mm-mm.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I think you froze for a bit.
Okay, tell me if there's any problem. But what's happened in Asia over the past 30 years, and it's happening now, is that China has grown to be much more powerful than it used to be. And as a result, it's beginning to think that it can dominate Asia, and it's throwing its weight around. And I don't blame the Chinese one bit. If I were a policymaker in Beijing, I would want to dominate Asia, just like the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere. If I'm Chinese and I'm looking at the border with India, as I become more and more powerful, I would want to settle all those border disputes on my own terms. And I would want to take advantage of the fact that I have become increasingly powerful over time. So China's behaving, in my opinion, in completely predictable ways.
Right. And so, is it necessary that China wants to be a global power then, or would you say that its current actions determine a dominance only in the Asian region?
Well, I think first, China wants to dominate its own region of the world. And at the same time, it wants to become a global power. It wants to imitate the United States. If you talk to the Chinese behind closed doors, they'll tell you that they're building a blue water navy that will allow them to project power outside of Asia, certainly outside of East Asia. They want to imitate the United States. The Chinese are interested in protecting their sea lanes between the Persian Gulf and East Asia. They're interested in being a dominant power in the Indian Ocean. They're interested in being a dominant power all across the Pacific Ocean. And I don't blame them one bit. I'm an American. As an American, I want to have a Navy that has no equal. I want the United States to dominate the world seas. Why shouldn't someone who's Chinese want his or her country to dominate the high seas if that's possible? And of course, what this points up is that you effectively have a zero-sum relationship when you talk about the United States and China. Only one country can dominate the world's oceans. If China dominates Asia, if China becomes a regional hegemon, the United States loses and we're pushed out of Asia. If we stay in Asia and we are a major player in Asia, China can't be a regional hegemon. So there's a zero-sum nature to this Sino-American relationship, and this is going to be the source of enormous trouble moving forward.
I want to discuss a little bit about Chinese buildup of weaponry and what it means for Washington's allies in the region. Do you think this buildup is more in direction towards its regional dominance or as a security strategy to possible confrontations with the United States?
Well, I don't think those are mutually exclusive things. I mean, the fact is that China does worry about the United States because as China builds up its military forces, the United States responds. You want to remember that in 2011, Hillary Clinton enunciated the pivot to Asia. Clinton said that the United States, she was Secretary of State at the time, is going to pivot to Asia, which meant move more military forces to Asia, which effectively meant we were going to move to contain China. The Chinese, of course, saw this as evidence of aggressive behavior by the Americans, and the Chinese thought that the Americans were interested in encircling China. So they increased their defense budget in return, which, by the way, then caused the Americans to further increase their defense budget for dealing with China. So you got this ratcheting effect in terms of what the two sides were trying to do. And what I'm trying to say to you is that the Chinese were definitely reacting to the Americans, right? And they viewed what they were doing as defensive in nature. But at the same time, there's a very powerful impulse built inside the Chinese foreign policy elite to dominate Asia. They want to dominate Asia. China wants to be the most powerful country in Asia, and they should be thinking that way. The Chinese remember what happened when they were weak. They call it the century of national humiliation. They are never going to allow themselves to be in a position where other countries are much more powerful than them and can push them around the way they did in the past. Furthermore, the Chinese, for completely understandable reasons, don't want the Americans in East Asia. They don't want the American military on their doorstep. I don't blame the Chinese one bit. I'm an American. I believe in the Monroe Doctrine. I don't want foreign great powers coming into the Western Hemisphere. I don't want the Chinese Navy in the Caribbean. So I can understand why the Chinese don't want us in the Western Pacific. But as an American, I can understand why we want to be in the Western Pacific and why we don't want China to be a regional hegemon. And again, all of this just highlights that you have this zero-sum competition that is going to lead to really big trouble down the road.
Right. So a bit inevitable question of technology. Actually, I had a follow-up question on this. How do you think other countries in the region India, Australia, Japan, South Korea, should respond to this military buildup, what is their best option or move right now?
Well, virtually all the countries in East Asia are between a rock and a hard place, which is to say, they're in a really bad situation. And the reason is that they have a great deal of economic intercourse with China. And all of those countries understand that their prosperity depends on good relations with China and continued economic interactions. At the same time, they understand that China is a military threat in the region and is a potential military threat to them. If you go to Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, Taiwan, Australia, so forth and so on, all those countries are very nervous about Chinese military power. But all of those countries understand full well that their economic intercourse with China matters greatly. And they don't want to alienate China because they don't want to lose prosperity. But at the same time, the Americans are telling them that they have to ally themselves closely with the United States. They have to join a balancing coalition with the United States against China. And those East European countries start pulling their hair out because they say, if we do that, we'll anger the Chinese and the Chinese will hurt us economically and that will undermine our prosperity. So the question is, what do they do at the end of the day? And my answer is that what they'll do is they'll privilege security over prosperity, and they'll ultimately join with the United States for fear that if they don't, their survival will be threatened. And protecting their survival has to be the number one goal. And at the same time, they will continue to go to great lengths to be nice to the Chinese, as nice as possible, so that they can maintain as much economic intercourse as possible. How well they succeed is hard to say, but they're in a very, very difficult situation.
Now moving on to technology. The US is working with its European allies to develop technology, and France and UK are actively trying to phase Huawei out of their 5G networks. Do you think American policy needs to be more robust to transition to the faster development in technological side better? Did America fall behind somewhere in this race with China, or does technology not matter that much?
Technology matters enormously. It matters because it underpins economic growth. The fact that the United States has Silicon Valley and has been on the forefront of developing sophisticated technologies for decades has helped fuel American economic growth. And the last thing the United States wants to do is allow the Chinese to dominate in terms of sophisticated technologies. When you start talking about cutting edge technologies, it's imperative from an American point of view that we remain the dominant player in the international system. Of course, from a Chinese point of view, their goal is to replace the United States, to become the dominant technological power on the planet. So that has huge economic consequences, and it has direct military consequences, because as you well know, these sophisticated technologies are incorporated into weapon systems. So this is serious business. And what the United States has recognized is that Huawei is a security threat to the United States. That allowing Huawei to become the dominant force in 5G technologies will have significant security effects. So not surprisingly, the Trump administration has its crosshairs on Huawei. The United States is trying to destroy Huawei. It's not just competing with Huawei in some benign competition. They're trying to destroy Huawei, trying to slow down Chinese economic growth, if not roll back Chinese economic growth. This is how great powers behave. Most people in the West find this very hard to understand, because most people in the West grew up during the unipolar moment. And they think great power politics are all about peace, love, and dope. We can all live happily ever after. Uh, that's not the way the world works. Great power politics is a brutal business. And great power politics is now back on the table. It wasn't present in the unipolar moment. The world that you were born into, the unipolar moment, was a world in which there was only one great power. And therefore, by definition, you couldn't have great power politics. Well, with the rise of China and the resurrection of Russian power, you're now in a multipolar world. There are three great powers out there, and they're going to compete with each other. And great powers are ruthless when they compete with each other. They behave in ruthless ways. And therefore, you should expect the Americans to do everything they can to slow down Chinese economic growth and to make sure that the United States, not China, dominates with cutting edge technologies like 5G.
Great. Let's talk about the practical positioning of aggressiveness as a policy, explicit public policy that both these countries play with each other. How long is this approach likely to sustain until there comes a time where they might have to cooperate on something or on an important matter like climate change or maybe another pandemic?
Let me make the general point that in any relationship involving two or more great powers, there's always cooperation as well as competition. During the Cold War, there were lots of examples of cooperation between the United States and the Soviet Union. The key issue that I point to when I talk about this is nuclear proliferation. The Soviets and the Americans created with each other to create the IAEA, the NPT, and then the Nuclear Suppliers Group, because the United States and the Soviet Union both believed that it was in their individual interests to control proliferation. So you got cooperation. And there are other realms in which the two states cooperated. But the question you have to ask yourself is whether or not you believe the relationship is fundamentally competitive or fundamentally cooperative. In other words, is it a fundamentally competitive relationship where you have some opportunities for cooperation, but essentially this is really all about competition? Or is it fundamentally a cooperative relationship where you will occasionally have bursts of competition that can be relatively easily ameliorated by the overall cooperative nature of the relationship? That's the question you have to ask yourself. And with regard to the Sino-American relationship moving forward, it is going to be, at its root, a competitive relationship. It is going to be quite nasty and quite brutish. But there are going to be opportunities for cooperation. Proliferation will probably be one of them. I believe the Russians, the Chinese, and the Americans all have an interest in preventing proliferation. And one would think there will be at least some cooperation among those three great powers to dampen down proliferation. Climate change is another example. Pandemics is another example. In these situations, there are powerful incentives for states to cooperate. And we should therefore expect cooperation. So only a fool would argue that moving forward, you're going to get nothing but competition between Beijing and Washington, and you're not going to get any cooperation. You are going to get cooperation, not a whole heck of a lot of cooperation, and it's going to be in the shadow of that strategic competition, which is going to be the defining feature of the relationship.
Right. Let's get on to elections and post-elections then. Trump administration's handling of the rise of China, do you think it has been adequate from Washington's point of view, or has it been clumsy and messy?
It's been clumsy and messy for sure. I mean, the biggest problem with the Trump administration is not so much how they deal with China, it's how they deal with our allies. The Trump administration has done a poor job of dealing with countries like Japan and South Korea. And the United States under Trump has done a poor job of putting together an alliance structure in Asia that can maximize America's prospects of containing China. I think that President Trump tends to be a bull in a china shop, and he tends to do things in ways that antagonize other countries, including America's allies. And America needs allies to deal with China. You want to remember earlier in the conversation, in response to one of your questions, I said that most countries in East Asia feel very ambivalent about siding with the United States against China because they believe correctly that their prosperity, their economic prosperity, is tied up in their relationship with China. They have to have good relations with China to maintain economic prosperity. Therefore, they're very skittish about joining forces with the Americans to form a balancing coalition against China. Well, given that circumstance, it's imperative that an American president go to great lengths to ameliorate as much as possible those allies' concerns. And President Trump has done exactly the opposite. He's been very heavy-handed with the South Koreans and the Japanese. And he's done very little, by the way, to facilitate improved relations between South Korea and Japan. And those two countries tend to hate each other. And for purposes of balancing against China, it's important that they work together, not be at each other's throats. But the Trump administration has not done a good job on that front. I think, however, the Trump administration is basically right in its operating assumption that the United States has to get tough with China on trade and on technology. We cannot afford to let the Chinese beat us economically. And that's going to require playing hardball. And I think in that sense, the Trump administration has been doing the right thing. And I think the Obama administration before that and the Bush administration before that dealt with China's economic growth in foolish ways.
The idea about alliance structures is something that plays into my next question. Do you think Joe Biden would do a better job in creating or maintaining this alliance structure within the South China Sea region, especially Japan, South Korea, those countries, in order to maintain just Washington's alliance with those countries?
I think there's no question that the Biden administration, assuming Joe Biden is elected president on November 3rd, I think there's no question the Biden administration would do a better job of dealing with allies in Asia and organizing a balancing coalition. I think the big question on the table is whether the Biden administration would be tough enough on the Chinese, especially on economic issues like trade and technology. As a good realist, I believe that the Biden administration would be tough on China. But there are lots of people who make good arguments that the Biden administration would be soft on China and that would cause the United States trouble. Again, I don't think that's the case, but this is, I believe, the big issue in my mind.
So immediately, though, in your opinion, what is more important, having that proper alliance structure or focusing more on being tough in terms of economic prosperity?
Well, both are very important. But I think anything you can do to keep the Americans on the technological cutting edge and make sure that our economy grows at least, if not faster, than the Chinese economy is the most important thing we can do. Relative economic growth is just of enormous importance. The two building blocks of power are population size and wealth, your ability to generate wealth. And the United States is an amazingly powerful country and has been for a long time because it has lots of people and it is a very wealthy country. And its ability to generate wealth is truly impressive. China was not considered a great power during the Cold War. You want to remember that. It was considered to be a bipolar world. We had the United States and the Soviet Union. China was considered a major power, but not a great power. Why was that the case? They certainly had enough people. The problem was they didn't have enough wealth. It was a backwards country economically. What's happened is that China has become an incredibly sophisticated country from an economic point of view. It's truly impressive when you go to China to see the economic prowess. And as a result, China is not considered just a great power. It's considered a potential peer competitor to the United States. It's because of its economic growth. So you see, again, the importance of economics, the importance of wealth generation, but also the importance of population. And this, by the way, is an area in which the Chinese face big trouble, because as a result of the one-child policy, China has an aging population. And there are a lot of people who believe that this is going to be a principal cause of a slowdown of Chinese economic growth over time.
Fantastic. To wrap it up then, a little lighter question. If you had the chance to give an advice to a policymaker in China for a policy that had to be implemented immediately, say tomorrow, what would your advice be?
My argument would be that it's imperative to remember, we're talking from a Chinese perspective, that time is on your side. Mm-hmm. And as time goes by, you become more and more powerful. So you don't want to do anything precipitous, right, that causes a crisis now, because you're not in a really good situation now. For example, on Taiwan, the Chinese don't want to take on the United States over Taiwan now. Better to continue to grow economically and militarily and move on Taiwan in 20, 25, 30 years, because the relative balance of power will shift in China's favor during that 3-decade or 2-decade period. So if I were the Chinese, I would concentrate on economic growth, growing the economy, and I would concentrate on not speaking to other countries in provocative ways. This wolf warrior diplomacy that they were employing in recent years was a major mistake. You don't want to scare your neighbors. You want to do everything you can to convince your neighbors that you have benign intentions. So again, my advice to a Chinese president, if I were in a position to give that advice, would be to lay low, right? Don't be too provocative in your behavior or in your rhetoric, and understand that time is on your side if you continue to grow the Chinese economy in impressive ways. And that's the most important thing to do.
Great. This was lovely. Thank you so much.
You're more than welcome.